Tonight we're privileged to have a sitting with one of the brightest minds of the continent, Professor Rafapa. Professor Rafapa will tell us who he is, where he comes from, what he stands for, and what his hopes and aspirations are for Africa as a whole. Prof, welcome to African Scholar Corner. How are you feeling, sir?
Professor, I'm fine. How are you doing today?
No, everything is okay.
I'm fine, thanks.
Prof, as you know, we need brain power to fix Africa's problems. Definitely. But let's start from the beginning. Who is Lesibana Rafapa?
Lesibana Rafapa is, my names in full are JRL, Jacobus Ramukukuvadi Lesibana Rafapa. I am the fourth child of the late Reverend Elias Malesela Rafapa. Mulimi was his African name. And my mother was a Lesu lady, Nei Lesu, a Mohwasha originally of the Ramashashan Ndebeles. That's what the Lesotho are all about. And her names were Raisive, Motepa, Lydia Rafapa. That's who I am. I was born and bred in a village called Sansloot or Sansloot under Induna Masinya in the Mokopane Tribal Authority. It's now Mogalakwena Municipal District to the west of the town of Mokopane, somewhere towards the border of Botswana from the town of Mokopane. That's where I was born and bred, and I started my primary school right there. Sansloot Primary School is called Marikodipuza now. In the 1960s, when I attended primary school, Professor, the school was an eyesore, but it managed to produce giants. The hard work of the teachers and the students and the self-propelling focus on one's goals drove us forward. I remember, I won't forget a day we were sitting in class with a lady teacher teaching us. She was facing us naturally, and her back was against the wall. Because the walls were cracked, and you could even see the class next door. A snake just came wriggling out of the crack. And all the pupils, me amongst them, we scrambled for the door, we jostled and ran out. But you see, this unfortunate incident for us children, kids those days, brought some kind of joy, because each time such a mishap happened, the school would be school out. The principal would announce, go home.
Yeah, that's what you're looking forward to.
Yeah, yes, kiddies, of course. The snake thing was a snake thing. We were scared, but we knew then we'd go home, arrive home early that day. Yes, briefly, my primary school days were characterized by those kinds of things. Alternating going to school and heading my grandfather, Jacob Lesu's cattle. Yeah, you know, Prof, in those days, I don't know how the teachers managed, because out of a 7-day week, you would attend school for 3 days.
Yeah.
The other days you are heading livestock, and then you come back. Those who were there the previous day are not in the class. But somehow they managed, and we managed to move together as a class and end up writing exams and passing. Thanks, Prof.
Is there a teacher who made an indelible mark on your exposition, your view to the world at that level?
Yes, I was lucky to be selected among the choristers in the school, and there was a choir master by the name of Makafula. Yes, you know, I don't think I'm as musically talented as you, Professor, but somehow, somehow the teachers had a way of selecting who could sing in a choir and who could not. We were just close to somebody having some gadget, and we were told do, ti, la, so, and the teacher listened to your voice, how you went up with the keys, and said, go get this side. Then you discovered, then you got into the choir, and when other children went home, you'd stay practicing for competitions until late in the evening. So Mr. Peter Makafula was very talented, and he won a lot of trophies. But as children, we just looked at that side alone because it meant an outing for us to go to the regional, local, regional, and perhaps, if we were lucky, even national tuata competitions.
Yeah, all the tuata competitions.
The old tuata, you know. Yeah, but I later realized that his emphasis always, this teacher, was on the vernacular song. And how he would interpret the lyrics was always the way he conducted the choir, infused somewhat with an African outlook, which we didn't quite understand at that stage. But in hindsight, one can actually refer back to it as some of the earliest inspirations towards who I am now. The second one was the late Mr. Dolo Shadrach. He was just good at offering the matter, subject matter. He made me wish to be a teacher one day, to aspire to be a teacher. And maybe he also contributed to me ending up following teaching as for training and ending up as a pedagogue in the classroom. Yes, I think those are some of the early influences.
And the high school years?
The high school years...
Because I know Mokopane was a little bit politically charged.
It was. Remember, we attended high school. We were the last class of 1974, when the old external exams, standard 6 in primary, were phased out.
Yeah.
So we were in the group that had to do standard 6 twice, because Form 1 until our day was a repeat of the standard 6 at primary school. The only difference was the English medium. so we were the last group, and then from there, the primary school standard 6 was phased out. And after standard 5, which is grade 7 now, one would go to secondary school. So when we went to secondary school, those were the very much politically charged days. Remember 1976, June 6th, when the uprisings broke out. Our group was, our class was in standard 7 or 8, because I did my matric, grade 12 now, in 1979. So 16 quarters in high school. And that spirit, each holidays I would visit my late uncle David Lesu and aunt Nema Kura in Diepkloof, Soweto. And you know, then you came across ruins, bent bottle stores, and so on. So the spirit was transported very easily. There was a lot of political ferment during the high school. There is no way one could have escaped political conscientization. It was not possible. Yes, Professor.
And you are also an author, and you started writing your books very, very early. What inspired that, and how early did you start?
Yes, in the same secondary school, Marikana High School in Faltein, Mushate, at Ramkopane. I wrote my first novel, Lerato Sillo, incidentally read this year by grade 11, prescribed by the Department of Education.
I also read it.
Oh, you did? Oh, in your high school days, Prof.
Yes, yes.
So my pen has actually educated a number of generations.
Yeah.
It is luckily regarded by the National Education Department as a classic.
Yeah.
So when they prescribe work, they take a contemporary novel in the vernacular, then they will want a classic, the Rafapas, the Matsipes, and others. I wrote Lerato Sello, the manuscript I completed when I was doing the former Form 3, before I could get to matric. But then I struggled to get publishers, handwritten manuscript. Publishers would want a typewritten manuscript. The old typewriters, I would have to go to the school principal and request to be allowed to use the school typewriter to prepare the manuscript. So then I was groping and looking for publishers, suitable ones. The book ended up seeing the light of day when I was in 1978, when I was in Form 4, because I did Form 5 in 1979, matric. Professor, you have asked a very crucial thing about my maturing as a child. Because writing a book at the age of 17 attracted media attention. The then SABC services, Black Language Services, Radio Legoa, and so on. And the World newspaper also published an article about this miracle boy who published a novel at such a young age. And it was, of course, when I wrote the manuscript, there were external Form 3 exams, and I wrote newspaper headlines because I was among the top 3 passes in the whole country. So you see, that kind of limelight and publicity coupled with publishing a book led to quite a number of interviews, being followed by reporters and so on. It came with a lot of excitement, but with a lot of pain as well. I learned at a very young age not to take contumely very seriously. You would be boarding a bus in school uniform, and you find people speaking very negatively about you out of jealousy. You know, a young person, a young boy from a village, from the Bundus, publishing a book. But you would also come across strangers who would be speaking so impressively about you. Imagine in a village, still locked in what one could say traditional superstition. I'm not talking of superstition in segregational racial terms, because I believe that superstition belongs to a certain race.
Yeah.
All humankind is superstitious at a certain level. Belief in witchcraft. In England, as far back as the Elizabethan era and before, you have to cross your chest. The black cat across the street, and witches were banned. So they are now growing up in a conservative, superstitious village, and being among a few children whose families believed in high school education and college education and university education, when the rest of the children dropped out in primary school and went to work on the farms. It sort of projected one somewhere above average, and that would attract some jealousy and praise and all that. So that trained me to be thick-skinned. People interacting with me even now might notice that Professor Rafapa Lisiwana can be thick-skinned. You can, if he believes in a certain direction, you try to dissuade him without valid reasons, stand his ground.
Mm.
and take all the punches without winning. So I think I developed a hard skin right from those days, you know, when I was still growing up, due to being thrown into fame like that, as I outlined, Professor.
Interesting, Prof. Now, fast forward.
Yes, Professor.
We are speaking to an old, mature professor.
Well, thanks.
Why did you decide to go and work somewhere? You decided to pursue academy.
Professor, it is partly thanks to parental guidance. So very few people are aware that at high school, I was so captivated by a certain piano player, a local one, who was very famous in Faltein, and we visited him as high school boys. And I went to my dad and said, Dad, I want to drop out of school and be a singer in a band. Oh, and now Prof Rafapa, you know, Fundisa Rafapa.
None of that.
They are preacher in an African initiated church and a staunch believer in education and profession. He would not hear any of that. You know, my son dropping out of high school to go and play the guitar or the piano. Maybe I would be a star by now. A very strict father.
Yeah.
But you know, he believed in education. He always instilled in us, myself and my siblings, that education is one of the only very few things left to liberate a black person, especially to heave up black families out of poverty. Poverty thrust upon them by apartheid conditions where opportunities were not equal and so on. So he saw education as a liberating tool. We imbibed it as we grew. Although I was lucky to be the first one in my family to go to university, my parents were very poor, Prof. I think there was a touch of luck because I became independent at the age of 20 when I was forced to be a private teacher. They were called private teachers.
Private teacher, yes.
Yes, I had applied for a position, I mean, for enrollment at the University of the North, now University of Limpopo. And there was no money. In those days, there was no NSFAS. Parents had to pay out of their pockets.
What is NSFAS, Prof?
NSFAS, the South African fund, you know, brought about by our national financial.
Or it's a financial assistance for South African students.
Yes, for South African students, yes. Started by the democratic government, although it is not as effective as it was conceived of due to sidetracking things like corruption and all that, but it's well meant.
Yeah.
Because children whose parents would not have afforded tertiary education can still go and they can be enrolled. When you apply for a position in a university, you also apply for NSFAS, you know, and when you are approved, NSFAS approves you, you can go there without your parents having money. So these things were not there under apartheid, and that's why only a few people could afford to go to a teacher's training college. We revered. We revered some of our elder brothers in the village. You know, in our culture, a brother is not one. Is not only the one from your father's house. Your older brothers. Anyone who went to Student College or Mkopani College or wherever, we revered them. If you went to a university, Teflo or Fort Hare, we put our heads in the streets when we met you because only a few lucky could go, partially because parents would have to foot the bill on their own. Now, my parents could not afford, Professor. I had to, when my age mates went to tertiary first year, I had to be a private teacher at Mantutule High School in Mapela under Khoshilanga. They were called subsidized positions, a contract for a year, and use that money to go and register the next year at the university. But that would not have been sufficient. I had to request an advance royalty payment from my best publishers. And they were pathetic and said, we don't give any author a loan. But because we are talking of an advance to go to school, we are prepared to. So my parents never spent a cent on me since I was 20. Being a private teacher like that was the end of my dependence on my parents.
Yeah.
And I even had to start helping my siblings. You know, when the meal, the bag was going lower and lower towards gravity, I would be reminded, or in the days of starving, people will laugh at you to see your siblings starving to death. Then you started supporting your siblings and your parents at the age of 20, 21. That's the path I've walked, Professor.
Wow, that's interesting. Now let's get into the thick of things. Let's talk African politics. Let's talk scholarship politics. Let's talk professorial issues.
Yes.
Perhaps let's start by defining an African scholar, which I believe you are amongst the elites.
Oh,
how do you define an African scholar? Because being black doesn't qualify one to be an African scholar.
Very true, Prof. It's like before we even go through the concept of being an African scholar or the idea of being an African scholar, just to be African by being born black, not imply one ipso facto or automatically qualifying as African.
Okay.
Now, an African scholar for me is someone who will rise academically, taking advantage or using as a springboard colonial education that we all inherited. We have a past, we have a baggage, we have some heritage. But even though taught what we may, for convenience, call Western type education, where you are taught inside a room with something called a chalkboard in front, because education has always been there, but the mode of teaching has not always been like that. So when the colonizers took over and the governments were imposed on African peoples, African scholars are among the cream that did not submerge and get consumed by the Eurocentrism in the offerings of education that came from the West. In other words, I believe that you can teach children, you can teach learners, pupils, university students. Some will just imbibe uncritically what is taught to them. If the education is meant to stunt them, to diminish their self-concept and self-esteem, then it will succeed. So an African scholar, although coming from that same background, should be able to grow intellectually and burst out of the bounds intended by colonial education, and use that very same education against its authors, and use it seminally to grow independent as a thinker and start steering the impartition of knowledge in the form of teaching if you are a teacher, the impartition of knowledge if you are a preacher in a church, away from the poison, so to say, that it would have been meant to be. So an African scholar is one who emerges and redefines himself, reinvents himself, molds and defeats the foundations of education that would have been meant to stunt him or her mentally. I think that's what an African scholar should be.
Is it possible for someone of a European descent to fall under that category of being an African scholar? For an example, we could use an Indian descent, but essentially I wanted to know if it's possible for a non-African to occupy that space of being an African scholar.
Yes, I believe so. I believe so. You know why I believe that is possible is it starts from the belief, and African scholars that influenced me through their writings have also said the same, that you do not become an African through birth in an essentialist manner. You learn to be an African, you become socialized by the elders to grow up as an African. That's why we always speak of self-discovery. You should learn what it is to be an African before you can be an African. So you're not born an African. So which would mean that white people, number one, they would have to regard Africanism as equal to other isms in the world. Mankind is equal, because you cannot love something that you disdain. Somebody of perhaps Chinese or Japanese or Indian or Malaysian or European origin has that attitude, that perspective of respecting Africanism, loving it, learning it like a black person would, because you are not born knowing what it is to be an African. That person in my mind can develop and grow to be an African, whether black or white, pink, yellow, or whatever. So I believe being African is non-racial. It's something that all of us need to love, embrace, imbibe, and grow through, learn, unearth through the leadership of the elders, the village elders and so on. So, I mean, that's why now I nearly left my head off, Professor, around Mokopane. It was the time the mountain school was closing and the initiates were graduating. And I bumped into a white man who had been to circumcision with the young boys in the village.
Wow, okay.
He had even acquired a mountain named Malesela. Malesela, but a white man. So you see, those are the kinds of people, if they are not pretending, if that is part of their consciousness and their lifestyle is African, then they can be Africans. Then they can develop from there to become African scholars, because also no one is born a scholar. So I have that kind of view. It is possible, Professor, yes.
Now, what is given our time in history, what would you say is the responsibility of an African scholar? First, towards himself; second, towards the immediate family, community, towards the continent, and towards the entire globe. What is the responsibility of this African scholar?
This African scholar who would have earned the appellative African through hard work and self-discovery and self-learning and self-definition and all that. Number one, should be hardworking enough and inquisitive enough to reach there and qualify to be called an African scholar, should be proud of being an African scholar. Of course, the entry point is being African, and not through the color of skin, through lifestyle and consciousness. Now, once you walk tall and feel proud of being African and even an African scholar, one responsibility, one duty is to positively influence those around you. And your family should be the immediate beneficiaries of your influence. You should be prophetic, prophetic not in the sense of speaking in tongues, prophetic in the sense of, as Skiam Patlele would define it, in terms of showing the path, even that you know what is right, and wanting people to see what you see as something right, and influencing people to move towards the direction that you see, you deem right. You are prophetic, you are a pathfinder, you show the path, and you are assertive, you don't waver, you don't shrink back, so people can follow you. So your family, your immediate family, Professor, I always tell people, would any father or mother be proud of himself or herself to actually be blessed with children, biological children, that you are very proud of? I have my own children carrying my own genes. Would you be happy to discover one day that all your children look like the man next door, physically, and behave like the man next door in mannerism?
No, he should look like the father.
Look like the father. So that's what an African scholar should be. My children must think like me, look like me. I might have a neighbor, a next door neighbor who's not African, a European, an American. Surely they should not look like the American next door or the European next door or the Russian next door. They must look like me. You see, because I believe that globalism does not mean leveling up identities. It means different distinctive identities having an equal stake on the global plane, where they are equal. So to be global or to be civilized, you don't need to turn from an African into a European or an American. You remain African and take your Africanness along to the global platform, so that the Europeans, the Westerners, will see you as a different person who is of equal worth to them. They should not. They may not wish to be like you because they're not African anyway, and neither should you wish to be like them. For what reason? Who said some are more important than others? So my children must be influenced by my neighbors. Because a professor is a teacher, a scholar is a teacher. Whether you stand in front of in a lecture hall and teach, through your research, through your publications, the speeches, the public speeches that you give, you are a teacher, you are an educator. So when you teach people to think African because you are an African scholar. That's what I believe is the role of which is the antidote of the colonial and imperialist project, which wanted to efface identities of the people who were once known as the peripheral, because they know themselves as the center. So if you are not an agent of transformation, negating and wanting to remove that wrong lens and its influence, then as an African scholar, you are inane. Maybe you are an African scholar just to earn a salary. And that cannot be fulfilling, because Because what if you earn millions, you even go and teach in Europe, become a billionaire, but there comes a stage when you are an elder, you are 70 years old,
Mm.
find yourself in accumulating material wealth.
Mm.
You want some depth in achievements. And one of your achievements should be, when you look back and take stock of the path you have worked, the people that were around you, the people you influenced, have successfully replicated your thinking.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think that's what an African scholar should set out to be or to achieve.
Right. Now you'll correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, Professor.
I think there is a perceived gulf between the role that an African scholar could play and the politics of the continent. Is it my imagination, or am I right to think that there is no linkage between what academics do and the chaps who are governing our different countries on the continent? In other words, is what we do in these institutions of higher learning having any effect on the politics of the continent? Who rules, how they rule, what policies are they putting on the table? Or are academics marginalized and only the liberators,
yes,
sitting pretty in corridors of power with little regard for what academics are saying? What is your take on that?
Yes, Professor. And you know, your question is consistent even with your earlier question. The influence that you have as an African scholar and the impact on your family, on your neighbors, on the people you have taught, on the people that emulate you as a leader in society. That impact should even go as high as the corridors of power.
Yeah.
The presidents of African states and the people they govern with. But actually, it is unfortunate if African scholars do not actually show the path through their thinking and convictions and lenses and perspectives to African politicians. Because I don't believe that politicians are the people who can benefit the world very fully, because, I mean, look, imagine, let's take an example of an African professor who perhaps was developing towards becoming an African scholar. In our circles as academics, if one of us were to stand for elections one day and become Professor so-and-so, who is also a cabinet minister, we normally, not necessarily publicly, regret losing an intellectual. So we regard the protagonists in government as intellectuals, so they cannot be African scholars at all. They should be shown the path by the scholars. The unfortunate part is that people with power tend to be narcissists. They tend to believe so much, to be so full of themselves that having political power or having ruling power is the alpha and omega. While not the case. I mean, today I was listening to a former cabinet minister in Zimbabwe, who is a professor now, and he was saying these borders the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe is not our border, meaning that it's a colonial border.
Yes.
But you see, as an African scholar, you should be able, just to give this one example, to educate this politician and say to this politician, you have the political power, my brother, or you once had. You might have fallen by the wayside. But you see, we need to think beyond the superficial leaders, and that is the business of intellectuals. You cannot say the colonial borders are not our borders when you fought a regime and there was independence in 1980, and as a black government you adopted the same borders. Now, in what sense are they not yours? In what sense are they not yours? Are they still Adam Smith's borders? Now, if they are not yours, and if you didn't embrace them on Independence Day, then they are not your borders. But if you embrace them, they are your borders because they belong to the present order. You might have changed the negativity of colonialism attached to borders, you see. But Professor, our people, even in so-called prehistoric days, you wonder when people say some things are prehistoric because they were not written. When did history start? But some things are said to be prehistoric, especially when it comes to where we come from as Africans. You would not get into another man's millie field and start planting your own seed.
Yes.
Because the millie field had boundaries. They were always respected from an African perspective.
Yeah.
So Africanism embraces borders. And you would not move from Ramalebo and get into Mulej.
And do as you please.
Yes, and do as you please, and not acknowledge you are not a citizen of Mulej. You can't have the same privileges and rights as Mulejans. Not because they hate you, they're not xenophobic. You just simply need to acknowledge. That's why we have a saying, the saying. There's no negativity in this. It shows mutual respect.
What does that translate to in English?
Means that the majestic wolf or hyena or jackal, because it is majestic in the bush. Once it crosses the boundary between the bush and tamed life, it cannot continue and be a wild jackal with majesty that it would have in the bush. That's just home turf. Then it becomes a dog. Remember, a dog,
domesticated.
It's a parody of the jackal.
Yeah.
So that's what it means. You cannot roar around and flex your muscle after crossing borders and behave as if you are on home ground. Now, to have had this misconception and very misleading interpretation from someone who has the title professor, who was once a deputy president of a free African state, say that, tells you a lot, because a professor is supposed to be an intellectual, a scholar, unlike a politician who can just sing slogans without depth, without content. Now, I just want to show that now. You see, as long as we still have politicians who think like that, it means that we are not doing our part as African scholars to seep into the balconies of power and have politicians admit that you are being a politician, having power does not necessarily mean that you are a thinker, you are an intellectual. You may say Africa, Africa, but if someone were to ask you to unpack what it is to be an African, then you get lost. So we're not doing enough. They are marginalizing us, but we should also strategize as African scholars to seep into the no-go areas, because power corrupts. So I don't think we're doing enough.
Yeah, that example was very, very momentous, because we're dealing with issues of borders and people coming to burden other
Yes.
countries and stuff like that. I think it's very critical, Prof. Now,
Yes.
let's get a little bit deeper into your philosophical position, your philosophy. What is it, and where is it coming from, and where is it going, and how useful do you think it is?
Professor, I think my professional project, which I believe is my calling, has always been reclaiming Africanism in teaching, in the curriculum, in published research, because there's no denying that these modes of preserving knowledge and propagating knowledge have been contaminated by evil intentions of some people who might claim to have been the founders of knowledge and education, falsifying invention and so on. So my philosophy is that we should excavate the truth about African excellence. We should Africanize the curriculum, Africanize it not by trying to say that Western concepts in philosophy do not hold water. I mean, if we were to talk about a qualitative research method or quantitative research method, as an African scholar, you are not going to say that is Eurocentric, because it's a tool towards reaching profound knowledge. Yet, throughout my teaching career, throughout my learning career, I've always juxtaposed, put side by side, those African concepts and Eurocentric concepts and philosophies, side by side with original African thinking, if only to demonstrate how more powerful and how much more older original African knowledge and invention has always been, although it was effaced. So that is the project throughout. There's a lot that we need to uncover about ourselves as Africans, that we must teach, that we must write about to negate the propaganda of the past, which came in many guises, including education.
Now, yeah, that's deep.
Well,
I know you are well read when it comes to Prof Skiam Hachele's African humanism. Does it anyhow influence how you think going forward?
Yes, I think it does naturally. Remember, when you choose a field of research for your PhD or your field of research, the content or the direction of your research trajectory beyond graduating for a doctorate, you do that deliberately. Nobody forces you to choose so and so for study. So I deliberately and consciously opted for Professor Skiam Patlele's fiction, because my specialization, my field is African literature, is English literature. But I emphasize African literature, South African literature, orality, because they're tied together. So it was a conscious decision not to select William Shakespeare as a subject of my PhD research, because it would mean nothing to me. So when you teach Milton's Paradise Lost inside of a university class, you teach it to glamorize and lionize Europe or Britain. You teach it to show that the things Shakespeare wrote about, the things Milton wrote about, were not English, they were humanity. And there are Africans of equal artistic dexterity
mm,
and poise,
mm,
who expressed what Shakespeare and Milton have expressed in a more splendid manner.
mm,
Now you have to teach those Western pieces side by side with African pieces to show the majesty of the African continent and the diaspora, even in creative writing and so on and so on. So Professor Mphahlele, when I went for oral defense at the University of Stellenbosch, there was this lily-white Eurocentric professor who was my external examiner, I won't mention names, who castigated me sort of for settling on S.K. Mphahlele for my PhD. And my response to her, she had spent all her life in Europe, all her life. She came back here only upon retirement or when she was on the verge of retiring. So her thinking was really wide. I'm not in a racist sense. She was so Eurocentric. She was happy why I selected S.K. Mphahlele, and she said there are so many writers you could have settled on. And why was S.K. Mphahlele? You see, almost similar to the question that you are asking. And I said, you know, I chose S.K. Mphahlele because what he writes is meaningful to me as an African.
Yeah.
So he doesn't invent Africanism. He announces it through a loud hailer. He gets on the top of a mountain and demonstrates that Africanism can also be captured and preserved in philosophical terms.
Yeah.
You see, now somebody with that kind of contribution is worth recognition, is worth inquiry, is worth researching on for PhDs and for writing papers, even beyond that. He has influenced me a lot. He has influenced me, he has strengthened my pride in being African. He has made me humble and modest and opened my eyes to the fact that being born black does not automatically qualify me to be African. There are so many black people who are not African at all. That's why the term coconut.
Yeah.
Like coconut.
Yeah.
Yeah, so no, he has influenced me. Although when you research on someone, you have to be dispassionate.
Yeah.
But you cannot research on something that you abhor.
Yeah, exactly. Now, as we move towards the end of our interview, Prof, yes. I've got a question that I want to pose you at the end. But before I transition to that question, I would like to, because you're talking about African scholars, I would like to hear, African writers. I would like to hear your opinion on Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Latest stance of discouraging people to write in English. Meanwhile, he has been formidable in writing in English. What is your position on that?
Professor Ngugi is one of the writers I studied undergraduate and so on, and Chidwa Achebe and the others, and the Mazizi Kunenes of this world, Njabulon Ndebeles. As a writer myself, as a scholar, as a researcher, as a thinker, I do not agree with Ngugi's stance that as Africans we should shun writing in English and only write in indigenous languages. Remember, all my 8 novels and about 22 short stories are in African language.
Yes.
So I'm not saying this because I look down upon African languages.
Okay.
But you see, when you write, there are strategies one can use to reach a broader audience. If you believe that writing in African language should not reach an audience, it should be read only by the people who understand the language. Then I think somehow you miss the objective of communicating, because communicating with as many people as possible would be a driving force.
Yeah.
But now, if you do not have the facilities for translation, for interpreting when you speak, then you speak directly in English, because just simply for the reason that English is the lingua franca, understood by the audience outside of their home languages.
Yeah.
So I think it's a question of communication here.
Okay, and reaching a wider audience.
Reaching a wider audience. So I don't think one should be prescriptive and as critical like in Google and say, let us abandon writing in English and write in African languages. I would say, let us write in both.
Okay. Yeah. Now, my last question, how do you see the future of African intellectualism, given the suffocating spaces that happen within churches, schools, government, mass media? You know, when in mass media, when you are a professor, they look the other way. Because I'm not sure whether is it because they don't want to engage with your ideas, or whether you will spoil the party by pointing to the flaws.
Yeah.
How do you think we should position ourselves as African scholars?
Professor, we have a myriad reasons why we remain confined to special sections of libraries as African scholars.
Yeah.
Which is very unfortunate.
It is.
I think some attempts made by our government research bodies of commercializing research can help a lot towards removing our research findings from the shelves and putting them in a factory where some commodities are manufactured, because we live in a knowledge economy. There is nothing that even factories can produce without having some semblance of a research office. But you will laugh, because the kinds of researchers you find in factories and the kinds of researchers you find in government offices cannot be equated or even compared with researchers in universities. Because while people who in power produce policies and programs, companies produce commodities for consumption. Universities are factories for manufacturing new knowledge.
Yeah.
So if we don't inject new knowledge in all these spheres, the world dies. So we're doing a lot, but I think we must be on our feet as intellectuals and not only write high-flown and very deep and conceptual and theoretical works, also try and reduce them to popular literature. You know, let us see Professor one day writing something in a newspaper that's understood by everybody.
Okay.
Of average knowledge. Let us participate in fora for ordinary men and women and impart some of our research in simple language, so that we can seep into social life. It is not easy if you are not welcome. You are so right that you would be with some attitude, but you have to continue and not give up. Different strategies and so on. Luckily, some politicians will register for a degree in your university, and you have to look at his or her proposal, master's, PhD. You have an opportunity there to mold someone who is a politician into an intellectual to a certain extent. Let us make use of those. So I think we should take advantage of a number of resources, also move out of ivory towers that our universities can easily turn into. so that we meet our detractors halfway, you know.
Yeah.
We do not allow them to give them sleep and peace. Let's worry them. Let's bother them.
Yeah.
Bother them. So some aid is needed there, Professor.
Okay.
Prof,
yeah. Thank you so much for getting us into your space and learning about who Professor Rafapa is, and please pass our gratitude to the family, because this is the family time, but
Thanks.
they generously afforded us the opportunity to engage. I want you, Prof, in less than 30 seconds to speak to African scholars, not me. Just give them a message.
Thank you. African scholars, let us please look at our project as African scholars seriously, and let us not use it as an excuse for laziness. Let us not feel lucky that we are African scholars, therefore we can avoid rims written on European philosophy, because we might end up reinventing the wheel, irrespective of the color of the tile. So please, let's be as hardworking, as diligent as all those pursuers of knowledge, but pushing forward African scholarship. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you. I'm excited. Thank you so much, and have a good night, sir.
Good night, and good night also to your audience, Professor. And thanks for inviting me. I'm humbled.
Thank you, sir.
Goodbye. Thanks.
Bye.